Hello, I'm Jane Hutcheon. Welcome to this 1+1 summer special, Nature Plus Nurture, where my guest is environmentalist Amanda McKenzie.
Hi, I'm Amanda McKenzie.
Amanda is in her early 30s and yet she's always been extremely focused. She wrote her life plan while she was on schoolies. She's the CEO of the Climate Council, a non-profit organisation which succeeded the Climate Commission. And this modern activist was instrumental in establishing the council through crowdfunding, getting people to donate through digital campaigning.
To those of you who are here right from the start, thank you.
Amanda McKenzie, great to have you on 1+1. Now, you're the CEO of the Climate Council. It's a privately funded organisation that replaced what was the Climate Commission, which was closed down in September 2013 after the Abbott government came to power. Amanda, you've done an awful lot with your life so far. Is there one moment which you feel was the most exhilarating time of your life to date?
I think the creation of the Climate Council was one of the most exhilarating experiences. We'd been abolished, as you said, as the first act of the Abbott government, and we had known that we were likely to be abolished, but we didn't know in what circumstances or when that would be. So we talked about how important the work of the Climate Commission had been, providing accurate information on climate change to the general public. And the view was that it was still a really important role to play and that we would want to continue doing that. But when we were abolished, we then made the decision we'll create a not-for-profit organisation and we'll step out on a limb and ask the Australian public to be a part of that and to fund it. So we essentially, over a sort of a period of 4 or 5 days, created a basic website, a basic video with Tim Flannery articulating what this organisation was going to do, and created a fundraising platform, and then stepped out into the media and said, we're going to create this new not-for-profit organisation. Will you get behind it, chip in and fundraise? And it was an amazing response. We launched the website at 12 o'clock at night. By 6 a.m. the next morning, we've been raising money at $1,000 an hour. I thought, okay, this hasn't even hit the papers yet. This is a good sign. By the time we'd done the press conference, we'd raised $128,000. And by the end of the first day, we'd raised $500,000. We'd been shut down by Twitter a number of times. I thought we must be buying followers. We were shut down by PayPal very stressfully multiple times because they thought we must be money laundering. We were raising money so fast. And by the end of the campaign, it was the largest crowdfunder in Australia's history. We'd raised over $1.3 million from 15,000 people. So it was an incredible experience to be part of, because in such a toxic environment often with the climate debate at that time, to feel like there were so many Australians behind it was wonderful.
I'm talking in terms of you, the person. I realise that what you've done is an incredible job, but as a person, what really excites you? There must be many, many kind of spiritual moments when you're out there on top of a mountain. And I was just wondering if there was some experience, because I know you do travel a lot, that really brought home to you what saving the planet was all about.
It was interesting, actually. I had an experience just last week where I was travelling in Costa Rica with my sister, and we were hiking in the Monteverde cloud forest, which is an amazingly beautiful ancient forest. And I recalled a story that I'd read actually almost 10 years before from Tim Flannery's book, The Weathermakers, which got me into climate change in the first place, which was a story of the golden toad. And it's a beautiful little creature that actually went extinct and was one of the first creatures that you could pinpoint as saying climate change had a really big impact on its extinction. And it was interesting to be in that forest in such an ancient environment and to be thinking about all of the effort that I've been putting in, that so many people have been putting in the decade since I read that book, and reflecting on just how important it all remains.
So when you go to communicate ideas, particularly with school kids and young people, what is it that they connect with most?
I think that people connect with a sense of agency. I think that people want to feel like there's something that they can do. They're worried about it, they know that there's a big issue, and they want to understand where their part is. So I think that one of the really valuable things that you can do in communicating with young people in schools or older people is to articulate how they can be involved and how they can play a role.
You said that when you grew up, your dad was a scientist at one time, your mum was a psychologist. You said you were always curious about the world, always asking your dad questions. What kind of things were you curious about?
I was curious about everything. I wanted to know why the sky was blue, how trees worked, how did they breathe, did they have brains? I'd want to know how human society worked as well. I was interested in why our country worked a certain way versus another country working a different way. So I peppered my dad with endless questions, and he always seemed to know the answer, which, pre-Google days, don't know if he really did know all the answers, but he certainly seemed to.
A young girl once asked the Dalai Lama what the most important trait to have as a young person was. And the Dalai Lama said, self-confidence. What do you think is the most important trait? What was the most important trait that you had when you were a kid?
I always had a sense of belief in my own judgment. And I'm a very analytical person. I think through things very deeply. And when I come to a conclusion, I have a strong faith that I've made the right decision. So I think that I've always had that. So self-confidence, I think, for young people is very important. But I think another aspect is courage. I think that we are at a time when we're facing unprecedented challenges globally, but also in so many aspects of life. And I think it requires people that are willing to be brave, step outside their comfort zone, do more than they think that they can.
What kind of traits did your parents pass on to you, do you think?
I think my mother is enormously hardworking, and she has definitely passed that on to me. She's also very caring of the people around her and enormously resilient no matter what the challenges are. She's cool, calm and collected and has an answer and a way forward. So I think that sort of problem solving I got from her. My father, I think, a sense of wonder at the world. He's not a religious man, but I remember him on hikes that we do saying, Amanda, this is God's own country, Australia. We've got these amazing forests, these beautiful beaches. This is the most spectacular place on earth and you need to appreciate it. So I think that sort of sense of wonder, but also a sense of taking risks. My dad was always encouraging my sister and I on adventures that we do to go caving or rock climbing or sailing, and I'd often be really scared. But Dad always would say, he'd believe in me and would assume that it was something that we should do. So he pushed me outside my comfort zone like that.
When do you think you first became interested in the notion of protecting the environment? Was there a time, you mentioned earlier that you had read Tim Flannery's book, The Weathermakers. Was there a time before that it hit you that, this was a finite, in a sense, place, a finite resource?
I'd always been passionate about the environment, even as a young child, and being very aware that this was something that was important to me and that we would need to protect the environment. When I was 18, I remember being at schoolies and my friends and I had all gone up to Byron Bay, and I took off an afternoon and went down to the beach and wrote my life plan.
Did you?
At that stage I could only see to 30, so I just wrote my life plan to 30, and I found it the other day, and it was the number one thing was save the world from environmental pollution. I don't know how I thought I could do that within 12 years.
I can't believe this. So you're 18, there's alcohol and stuff going on all around you, and you write your life plan.
Yeah, I was always a bit of a nerd like that, lists and goals and things. But the interesting thing about being a young person is you don't know what's impossible, you don't know how hard it is or how ambitious it is. It's just like, oh, well, that's the most important thing to do is to save the world. So I suppose I better do that and do it pretty quickly.
So when you left school, you went to university, you studied a BA at first. At that time, did you have an inkling what you were going to do? You're always kind of forced, I suppose, at the end of school to make a choice about your career, even if you don't know exactly what it is that you want to be doing. Did you have that dilemma?
I had a plan that I would study art science, and I thought that in the science component, I would come up with some invention that would save the world from environmental pollution. Then as I went through, I got to third year organic chemistry and in these very long pracs and thought, this isn't really where I want to go. And at that stage, I'd become very interested in history and politics. So I transferred to do law at that stage and thinking, okay, I'll take a different tack and I'll go to the UN. The UN is where we'll get some change. We'll do it on a global level. I don't think I had a really good appreciation then of how challenging, obviously, the UN environment can be.
But while you were studying law, so you hadn't even finished, you were already quite active both in organisations within the uni, but also the Youth Climate Coalition. How did that come about? Was that in your spare time?
Yeah, I was always very passionate about a whole range of different issues. So when I was at high school and university, I did legal work for refugees and for environmental organisations. I edited a journal of peace studies. I protested against the Iraq War. I volunteered on conservation projects, pulling out weeds. I did a whole array of different things, trying to work out what I was interested in and generally wanting to contribute and have a life that was meaningful. It was not, though, until I found climate change that I became very focused. I think when I understood the gravity of climate change, I realised pretty quickly that it affected everything else that I cared about. Whether it was extreme weather events hurting poor people more than anyone else and the inequity of that, whether it was thinking about the world's areas that are already under pressure like India or Bangladesh and thinking about the impact of extreme weather or water security and what that meant for their national security or refugees. It seemed very obvious to me that this could be a major humanitarian catastrophe that would affect everything I cared about. So that made me immediately very focused on climate change as the core issue I wanted to dedicate myself to.
Tell me about how the Australian Youth Climate Coalition came about.
My sister and I had started an organisation called Ascent, the Australian Climate Change Education Network. We'd done this because we thought we could try doing something, and basically it was giving presentations in universities and in schools. My now very good friend Anna Rose had been travelling in the United States and had seen an organisation called the Energy Action Coalition, which was a coalition of youth organisations around the US that were then having some real impact on the national stage and providing a voice for young people. So she called me and she was organising a summit of lots of youth organisations to see if we could do something similar. So my sister and I went along and thought it was a good idea, and then we created the AYCC at the end of 2006.
What was the seed of managing to get a whole load of other young people to believe in basically what you believed?
I think it was illustrating that young people were at the forefront of this issue, that young people stood to lose the most as they would grow up in a changing climate, but also that young people have a very important role to play in social movements that create significant change, and that young people didn't have a clear role in the climate change debate at that stage, and that if we came together as youth organisations, we could provide young people that platform and a role to get into the debate.
You helped to set up the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. You were working as a communications advisor to the Climate Commission, which was at the time headed by Tim Flannery. And then the organisation was closed down. Was that expected?
Yes, we were expecting that it would be closed down, but we didn't know in what circumstances that would happen, whether it would be gradually the funds would be cut off, whether it would happen instantaneously or 6 months down the track.
This morning, Minister Hunt informed me that by phone that the Climate Commission had been abolished.
The Abbott government has wielded the axe again, scrapping the Climate Commission.
Just overnight, the new government sacked the Climate Change Commission and Professor Tim Flannery.
I'm very, very sad. I read in the paper today that Tim has been sacked.
Whose idea was it to, in a sense, throw the Climate Council out to the public?
I remember it was probably about 6 months before that. We were travelling for the Climate Commission and Tim and I were in an airport somewhere, and I said to him, how about if we made this a public institution and we got it funded by the general public and it was a not-for-profit? And Tim just rubbed his hands together and said, that's a really great idea. And Tim's the type of person who's willing to take a risk. And so we put it to the other commissioners, and then when it was abolished, we went back to everyone and said, well, do we want to do this? And they all said, yeah, we do.
So there was this huge risk because there was a good chance that people could have said, oh yeah, we're always asked for money, we'll think about that one. When you put it out there, was there another model like it in other parts of the world?
There wasn't any other models like the Climate Council, but there is a lot of experience in crowdfunding, and GetUp is probably the best example in Australia of fundraising digitally for particular outcomes.
So is that what crowdfunding is?
Crowdfunding is basically just asking your crowd, the people around you, to chip in for a project that you're doing. To do our work in the longer term, we need stable funding. So today we're asking you, our founding friends, to keep investing in our work. It can have a lot of different manifestations, but obviously the digital environment allows that to be significantly amplified.
So as a result of that, you managed to raise more than, I think, $1.5 million, which was enough to set up the Climate Council and keep it going into the future. Can you tell me what lessons were learned from Barack Obama's campaign?
We had a perfect storm scenario. We had a government had just come in and had abolished the Climate Council as the first act of government. Tim was very popular. It was very well recognised that climate change, there was a huge misinformation campaign and people were passionate about good information. It was very publicly recognised. There was a huge amount of media coverage on it. Barack Obama's campaign is often attributed with doing a whole range of great things, mobilising people online, and one of those was fundraising. And I've read a lot of the material that they produced after that campaign in terms of how you engage people. But in a lot of ways, fundraising online isn't that different to fundraising in other forums. We've got a new toolkit, and it's about utilising those toolkits. You do need some technical skills, but ultimately the communication techniques are the same. It's good communication is good communication, whether it's online or whether it's in the media or in a speech.
So in your 10-year career, what has been, I suppose, the most toxic time in the debate about climate change?
Certainly while I was at the Climate Commission and the carbon tax debate was going on, I think it was the start of 2012 and 2011 in particular, was very negative, particularly in the media conversations. But what was interesting was we spent the whole of 2011 and 2012 travelling around Australia doing public meetings, meeting with all sorts of different sort of stakeholders on the issue. And it was really interesting to see the contrast in the public where overwhelmingly, even if people don't agree in Australia, we're generally pretty respectful of each other and will listen to people's point of view.
You see, I don't know if that's true, to be honest, because I speak to people from all walks of life, and there is a lot of scepticism. There is a lot of belief that climate change is something that has been trumped up by a certain, albeit large, group of scientists. How do you address that, or do you only preach to the converted?
Well, it's interesting. The CSIRO has studied this now for 5 years and has found that consistently about 7 to 8% of people are genuinely sceptical. They don't think the science is real. They don't believe anything's changing. But they also found that the perception was that roughly half the population was sceptical. And that reflects partly, I think, a media conversation, but partly that sometimes people that are contrarian are the loudest person in the group. So I think that what we find is generally people are really concerned about this. They want some sort of action. And the best thing to do is get away from some of these historical conversations where no one's going to change their mind and move on to the conversation about let's look at the impacts that are already happening and how we address them.
Amanda, you could have easily joined a political party. You could have possibly been in Parliament by now. Why didn't you?
It's interesting looking at the training ground for young people today versus maybe in the 60s or 70s. I think a lot of my peers who may have gone into politics in an earlier decade are all doing issue-based campaigning. They're starting organisations like the Oak Tree Foundation or the AYCC, and they're cutting their teeth in issue-based campaigning rather than joining political parties. And I think it's partly a sign of the times. I think that issue-based campaigning is significantly larger maybe than it was then, but it's also a question of maybe a lack of faith in the big political parties and a sense that a lack of clarity around values.
At one stage, you managed to convince Al Gore to come and do a video conference for a big conference that you were organising. How did you begin to do that?
We knew Don Henry at the Australian Conservation Foundation, who has a strong relationship with Al Gore. So we pestered Don significantly and convinced him that this was going to be a really good event and that Al Gore was going to be vital to its success. And he was very supportive of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and the work that we were doing in mobilising young people. So he approached Al Gore, and I think we pestered him for a few other avenues as well, and we were lucky enough that he said yes. He has generally seen Australia as an important environment for action on climate change. We are a very fossil fuel dependent economy, and we're the 13th biggest emitter in the world. We're actually quite a significant player. So Al Gore, as well as a range of other international luminaries, have focused on Australia.
You have also been to some of the very big global conferences around the world. I've been to a couple of those as a journalist, and you sometimes ask yourself, what can be achieved with all those people in such a short time? Often it can seem that it's all about that big picture at the end with all the big happy smiles. Is there more to it than the publicity, than the photo op?
I think there is. There are real outcomes that get achieved in the international discussions, and it's just unbearably slow a lot of the time. And I think sometimes we look to big global conferences to get the desired outcomes, but actually the way the world works is that the domestic outcomes that are implemented, so whether it's carbon trading schemes or renewable energy policy, is actually those domestic achievements is what pushes outcomes at an international level. And I think there's real value in the momentum that those conferences bring. When you get world leaders all together, it creates a sense of solidarity, it creates a sense of in the global public that this is very serious, that countries are moving. It creates an opportunity to illustrate the achievements that have been created in the interim period. But they can be very frustrating as well.
Many people would look at your CV and say that you're extremely young to be a CEO. What is the biggest setback that you've encountered to date? And how do you learn from that?
I think the Copenhagen conference had a really big impact on me.
That was in 2009. It was perceived at the end that hadn't worked, that conference.
Yeah, so it was a gathering of all the world leaders, and it was touted to be the moment where we would see a new agreement. And everyone was devastated with the result because it wasn't as good as we had hoped. And organisations globally, scientists, businesses, NGOs had all put in huge amounts of effort, and we had done that too at the AYCC. And we'd taken a youth delegation over there. We'd be working for 3 years with a global contingency of youth organisations all around the world, coordinating efforts. And when the conference didn't succeed how we hoped, we went home, and I remember we all took about a month off in January, and then we all met together in our office, and we lay down on the floor, and we were just all exhausted, and we were running out of money, and we didn't know what to do next. Over that period of sort of the January and February, there was a very strong vested interest campaign of climate denial in Australia and also many other places in the world that took advantage of people like us that were just exhausted. A lot of the advocates worldwide took time off after that period. So that was really about regrouping, and a key point to learn, of course, is that in a journey of creating change, there's never an end moment. There is only a series of moments on the way. So Copenhagen was never going to be the end moment in where everything would be achieved. Rather, we should have been looking at Copenhagen as one point on a journey. So we needed to be thinking about the campaigns that came after Copenhagen at the same time as building up to that moment.
So when you do go round and talk to conferences and schools and someone asks you, how did you become a CEO in your late 20s, how do you respond?
I think my response is just I seized opportunities when they arose, and I just followed my passions. At each stage in my career, I think less about it as a career and more about my mission. If you like, I have a deep sense of purpose, and so I've followed what I thought is the most impactful work that I could do at any one time. And as I followed that journey, it's led me to where I am. And I suppose I just look at where I am now and think sometimes people can underestimate young people, that they see youth leaders as on their training wheels, and it's not very useful, I think, for our society.
It's not very respectful either.
It's not respectful, it's not useful, because young people can offer so much. You know, like Einstein in his 20s created his theory of relativity. Alexander the Great had conquered huge parts of the ancient world by the time he was 30. It's not really a question of age as to how much you can achieve. It's really about your passion and commitment.
Do you have any regrets?
I don't have regrets. There are things that I could have done better, and I think when I feel a bit despondent about climate change, which happens from time to time, you know, I suppose I look back and think, could I have done more? What else could I have done? Could I have communicated more effectively? Could I have worked harder? Could I have done my job better? Would someone else have done it better than me? But I just look back and think I've tried as hard as I can, and that's all you can do, really.
Amanda, you've got a little bit of a symbol, I suppose, which is a hummingbird.
Yes. When I left the AOICC, I was given a hummingbird necklace, and since then I've become a bit of a collector of hummingbirds, and this one's the latest one, which is from Costa Rica.
It's divine.
It's very gorgeous, and I was inspired by a story that I heard from Wangari Maathai, and she is a Kenyan activist who worked for many years on the Green Belt movement there, and was a renowned environmentalist.
So Wangari Maathai told you this story about a small little hummingbird and a fire that breaks out in a forest, and how the hummingbird felt that its contribution was as worthy as anybody's and was just dropping little bits of water, and eventually other animals started to do the same thing. So I'm guessing the whole purpose of the story is to say that no matter how little your effort, just the whole effort of doing something is worthy in itself. Would that be fair enough?
That's exactly right. I think we all have moments of feeling like, I'm just one person. What impact could I possibly have on the world? But certainly that's how someone like Barack Obama or Nelson Mandela or Gandhi must have felt at some point. We're all just one person. And within the skills and capacities and time that we have, we can all make a difference. We can all be like the hummingbird.
Amanda, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on 1+1.
Thank you very much.